Welcome to the Estate Planning Made Simple podcast by LSPN, one of the nation's largest and best estate planning networks. The information provided on this podcast does not constitute legal advice. All information, content, and materials available on this podcast are for general information purposes only.
Well, I'm glad that we could meet again today. And, what we're going to be talking about today is planning for your legacy. So over the last few weeks in this podcast, we've been sharing a little bit about things to consider as part of your overall estate planning, your documents, make sure that things are protected. One of the things I think that we overlook, and sometimes we put it into a different category in our mind, is the idea of legacy planning. So, when we think of estate planning, we think of documents. When we think of legacy planning, it sounds very intangible. So hopefully what we talk about today will put it in a little bit more concrete terms and will help you to understand kind of how it relates to estate planning in general and why it's so important to consider what your legacy is when you sit down and think about your future plans for your estate, for your family, and for emergency planning and, all the things that we've been talking about on this podcast. So the first thing is, what is a legacy? A lot of times when we think of a legacy, we think, well, that's just, the money I'm going to leave behind, the assets I'm going to leave behind. That's the legacy for my family or for my kids or for my, for whoever I plan to leave it to. But the reality is a legacy can consist of lots of different aspects of things, right? It doesn't have to be just assets or just money. It can be a legacy of memories. It could be a legacy of giving, right? Of being involved in philanthropic activities, or it could be a legacy of experiences. It could be, there's any number of different things that a legacy can consist of. And most of the time we limit ourselves on how we leave a legacy to only the assets, right? And so if you want to leave a legacy of money, it's very simple. You can get the biggest, fattest, life insurance policy that you can qualify for, millions of dollars, and you can leave that in perpetuity, right? And that's going to leave a legacy of money. That's very easy. To leave a legacy that's going to last, that's going to perpetuate, that's harder, right? So there's a story that we talk about all the time that is related to kind of this idea of leaving a legacy and the difference between whether you actually leave a legacy that will continue or whether you leave a legacy that just kind of evaporates. And that's the story of the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. So for those of you who are not familiar with the stories of these families, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers were both extremely wealthy families. John D. Rockefeller at his peak was the richest individual in the history of the United States at the time. He had built an enormous, empire that consisted of, the oil industry, and before that, kerosene industry, and stuff like that. And then Carnegie became kind of the steel mogul in the United States, and he was the only person to rival Rockefeller at the time in terms of wealth. And so these are extremely wealthy families. They had, in today's dollars, billions of dollars. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the Carnegie family and the Rockefeller family, there was a lot of similarities between them. There was a lot of, charitable giving. There was a lot of, large businesses and enterprises and wealth and everything that transferred. But within 3 generations, the Carnegie family had lost almost all of their wealth, and the Rockefeller family still had significant amounts of their wealth. So what's the difference? Why was there a difference between the two? And how was the Rockefeller family able to maintain that legacy of wealth from generation to generation when the Carnegie family was not? And the answer is, and there's actually a really good book, if any of you are interested, that you can go look up. It's called What the Rockefellers Do. And basically in this book, it explains that the difference is the mindset that John D. Rockefeller went into his planning with. And his mindset was he didn't want the wealth to be distributed and therefore to be lost. So if you think about the average estate plan, the regular, normal process of things, somebody leaves a will, they leave a trust, they leave, instructions that they want to divide out their assets to their kids. and then their kids receive it and they go spend it or they go use it or whatever. And maybe some of that gets passed on to the next generation. But over time, the wealth basically shrinks because it's being split into different shares for different people and used for different things. And eventually it's going to dissipate. John D. Rockefeller didn't want that. So he wanted the wealth to be maintained centrally. So he established what we call today a dynasty trust. And this type of structure allows the wealth to all be maintained together. And every time that the money, the wealth, the value leaves, and it's given to somebody within the family to help them with starting a business or with college or whatever it is, that money is going to come back because it's given in the form of a loan, or it's given in the form of, a payment out that's going to be repaid through life insurance, or there's some method that money comes back and then it perpetuates for the next generation. That's what, you look at large universities and those sort of things where they have endowment funds. That's the idea of the endowment fund. Yes, the money's being used, it's being spent, it's being invested, it's being, given in scholarships, but the money's always coming back in some way. And that's the idea of perpetuating that wealth, right? So, the average inheritance lasts less than 7 months, whether it's $10,000 or $10 million on average, it's going to last less than 7 months statistically, right? So if we want to preserve those assets or that wealth or that, legacy of money, then we need to have something that's going to maintain the legacy in the way that you would have wanted it to be maintained. Otherwise, human nature will take over, right? And it's just going to take the path of least resistance, which means it'll probably just be spent. And a lot of us, when we do our planning, we think, well, I just want it to be simple. I just, I don't really care that much. I'm going to be gone. So what if I just, give everything to the kids and I don't care what they do with it? They live their life, right? But the thing is that if we saw sometimes what happens when we do that, we would roll over in our graves, right? Yes, I don't care how my kids spend the money, but if they're spending it on drugs or alcohol or that sort of thing, then I do care, right? Or I don't care who they decide to leave it to, but if they go through a divorce and they have a witch for a wife or a husband, and they decide to leave all the money or half the money ends up going to that person, then you would care, right? So a lot of times we imagine that we don't have a preference, and especially after we pass away, that we won't have a preference on what is done with our stuff, with our money, with our connections, with our values, anything that we want to leave to the next generation. We imagine that we're not going to care anymore. But under certain circumstances, we actually would. And so if it's important to us, we need to put something in writing, some kind of framework to perpetuate what we want out of our legacy, right? And so we came up with a recipe for how you leave a legacy, right? And this recipe is pretty simple. We're not going to go into a lot of depth today, but we're just going to share what this recipe is. And then in future podcasts, when we touch on this topic of legacy planning again, we'll go into more depth. But the idea of the planning your legacy is, number one, again, whatever assets, whatever money, whatever, you're going to leave by itself is not enough in order for it to establish a legacy. Beyond the actual whatever wealth or whatever the item or whatever it is, whatever you're leaving, beyond that, you need to have guidelines, and those guidelines need to be in writing. It needs to be in a legal form, right? And so that's how it crosses over into your estate planning. If you have a will, if you have a trust, in the case of John D. Rockefeller, he had a dynasty trust. It gave guidelines on what he wanted to see, what was important to him, how it was supposed to be used, right? And those guidelines then are what's going to be followed by the next generations and from generation to generation, right? So those guidelines form the framework for what is going to happen with the assets and therefore what the legacy translates into. The second piece is not the guidelines. You need to give a purpose for why those guidelines exist. So I know a lot of us are parents. I'm a parent, right? My oldest kid is 9. They don't always listen to everything we say. And if we tell them to do something, they might question it, right? They might have their own way of thinking. They might not understand why we're telling them to do something. And even though it might be good for them, they might not want to follow those rules, or they might not want to follow those guidelines, right? And so we need to give context, because without the context, then, especially anybody who has a rebellious streak in them, they're going to question it, and that they may or may not do it. And even if they do it, they might not do it properly. Right? So we want to get into their mindset, and the only way to do that is to give the context for why those guidelines exist. And so what you want to do is you want to leave expressions of value, expressions of your values, right? And so the idea is to provide the context for why you set up the plan, the guidelines, the instructions this way, by putting it into context of what's important to you. And so, those expressions of value can take the form of like an ethical will. It can take the form of expressions of, of love, of caring, of, why certain things are important. Maybe you're leaving money and you say, well, this money is going to be used for grandchildren, great-grandchildren to pay for college. Why? Because I feel that education is the pathway to success, or whatever it happens to be, right? But that's your expression of value. So now they know why you left the guidelines, why you left those instructions. Now you have to add to that the third ingredient, which is the context for why you have those values. Because again, just because I think that something's important, my son, my sister, my cousin, whoever I'm, speaking to, they might not agree. They might not hold those same values. They might have different experiences in their lives, right, that make them think in different ways. We talk about politics and how divided the country is, right? How are you going to get a room full of people, and just imagine from generation to generation, getting a room full of people that all agree on all of the same things? Well, it's probably impossible. And so what you want to do is not just tell them what you think and why, but you also want to give a context for it, because then they can put themselves in your shoes to understand why you think the way you do, why those values are important, and why they should be perpetuated, right? And so as you put together these expressions of values, the third ingredient is to leave your life stories, because that is what informs why those values are important. And so the context of, your life experiences are what color the way you see the world. And providing those life stories, whether it's in the form of your personal memoirs, maybe it's specific stories from, your experiences, your life. Maybe it's saying, by the way, I think that it's important to make sure that we can defend ourselves because I was in the military, or because I, had this experience that happened to me where I was not prepared to defend myself and it was a bad experience, or there was, whatever it is that colors your experiences to make you believe the way you believe based on your personal life, your personal experiences. That's what you want to also hand off to the next generation. And this goes not just for your family, by the way, but if you want to leave a legacy in business, if you want to leave a legacy in an organization, maybe a nonprofit or some other institution, and you want to make sure that things are going to continue in the way that you envision them continuing, you want to provide those guidelines, those instructions in writing in a legal form, so that they have to be followed, right? Or at a minimum, they're likely to be followed. And then you want to inform it with those statements of intent, those statements of your values, right? Your value statements. And then finally, with the stories of the institution or of your life or of, whatever is going to inform where those values came from. And that is the foundation for leaving a legacy. And so, once you have those three ingredients, then you can start to rely on a legacy that can perpetuate from generation to generation, that will last beyond yourself. So the question is, when we do planning, when you think of legacy planning in particular, the question to ask yourself is, how do you want to be remembered? When you're gone, how do you want the individuals that are part of your organization or part of your business or part of your family, how do you want them to think of you? How do you want them to remember you? What are the things that maybe after you're gone, and especially if it's something that's unexpected, that you would want them to be reminded of? Maybe you can build into your plan methods and ways to remind them of your love, right? Or to remind them of your example. And I'll give you an example of that. We have one of our attorneys in our firm, and she was telling me one day about her father and his grandchildren, right? And he would take them out to 7-Eleven, on Saturdays or Sundays, I don't remember which, but on the weekends to basically just to spend time with them, and a couple of the grandchildren at a time, or maybe all of them at a time, and they'd go get Slurpees or whatever, and it was just a good experience. And one time, one of the grandchildren was acting up. They weren't being good, right? And so she says, "Oh, you're not going to 7-Eleven with Grandpa." But Grandpa comes back and says, "No, they can come to 7-Eleven regardless of whether they've been good or not, right? They don't have to earn it. They don't have to earn my love to, go to 7-Eleven." And it bothered her. And so she kept thinking, well, why is that? Why would he allow them to go, even whether they should or not, or they earned it or not, or, why is that so important to him? What she didn't realize, and she realized later, was these were the quality moments of, where he was able to connect with his grandkids. It wasn't about the reward. It wasn't about the Slurpees. It was about quality time with Grandpa and being able to, it's an expression of his love and connecting with them, right? So if Grandpa passes away, what if there was a fund that allowed for, people in the family to be able to take the grandkids or to take the great grandkids or whoever to 7-Eleven on a weekly basis or once a month or whatever in memory of Grandpa? Well, that means something. It only means something if they know where it comes from. And it only means something if it's, something that is perpetuated, that continues, but that sort of thing can be set up. Same thing with, we have some of our clients that have vacation homes, or they have their beach house or whatever, and they want to leave that in the family. They want it to continue from generation to generation to generation. Well, that's great. But why, when the great-grandchildren or the great-great-grandchildren sit down and they say, why are we keeping this house on the beach? Nobody ever uses it. Why do we want it? Why don't we just sell it, right? Well, because the trust says we shouldn't sell it. Well, that's not good enough. You want to give context, right? So we have one of our clients that, she has a beach house. She wants to leave it for the family. But what's important to her is that the family stays connected. So we put into the documents and say, okay, well, we want the family to have a regular family reunion once a year. We want them to, have, family outings and holiday events, and we want them to all come together. And that's the reason for this house. Keep this house because every year when you do, these special events or whatever, holidays, we want the family to come together. That's important to us. And then maybe share some examples of why that was important to them, right? That's the basis for leaving a legacy that will continue. So hopefully that's, some things that will be helpful as you think through planning your legacy. We're going to open it up for some question and answer. We did have one question here in regards to, I guess they said, if I've written a book, how do I make sure that continues, because there's only a limited copy of the item or the book, right? So one of the things that happens all the time is we do planning for collectibles. We do planning, like, for example, I have a client right now that we're helping with. He has a big car collection. Well, as big of as his car collection is, he doesn't have enough cars to leave for everybody in the family, right? And a lot of collectibles are more valuable if they're all maintained together, right? So we can't leave it for everybody, but there are some things that you can leave for everybody. And the memories are something that you can leave for everybody, right? And we can find a way to be able to perpetuate those memories or those values, even if we don't leave the actual items or assets. In the case of personal memoirs, in today's world, those things can be digitized. If you have a book, maybe a family history book or something like that, there's no reason it has to be a physical copy. Those things can be perpetuated, and they can be shared, and they can be, transferred and so on in other forms that everybody can receive. And, we have one of our clients who has a big gun collection. And so he wanted to leave, one or two of his pieces to different grandchildren and different children and so on. But again, the whole collection is what's impressive. And so what we did was we put together a book that had pictures of each of the different pieces. And it would actually give a little story of how Grandpa got this gun or got this, firearm, and a couple examples from history of how those were used, and then you have this whole story. But every person that received one of the guns received a little letter from Grandpa also saying, this was my 22 when I, went hunting for my first time, blah 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 blah, right? And now, receiving a gun, that's one thing, but receiving the memory is another thing. And so that's one of the things to consider and to remember as you're doing your planning. How do we make it more meaningful, and how do we pass on the memory instead of just the item? Let me just finish with one last story. I'm actually currently at an event with a pretty well-known author, right? And he was just sharing with everybody about the idea of when he first wrote his first book and why, and kind of how that happened. And he was actually on the stage at an event, and he was sharing with everybody some thoughts. And then afterward, everybody swarms him, right? So there's a few hundred people, a couple thousand people that swarm him, and they're asking him all kinds of questions. And everybody keeps asking him what the name of his book is. And he tells them that he'll send them a copy. But he doesn't have a book, right? He hasn't written a book. And then so that he goes and writes the book, right? But he's talking about how that ended up opening doors for him professionally, right? And how it just kind of changed his approach in business and what he did and how and everything. A lot of times when we think of our legacies and when we think of our estate, we think of it as something that we do once and then we forget about. But the reality is that if you want to have a legacy that will perpetuate, it's something that you need to cultivate, right? You need to devote attention. You need to devote conversations. You need to devote relationships to facilitating that legacy. And in a lot of ways, it can change the way that you live life. And it can give more meaning also to how you live life. And so I think it's valuable for us to be considering our legacy as part of our planning.
This has been Estate Planning Made Simple, a podcast by LSPN. Join us next week on Clubhouse and on all major podcasting platforms.